Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Truglia, and I'm going to jump right into responding to Dr. Gavin Ortlund on the issue of icons. I purposely waited to do a response because, judging from commenters, emotions were running high. And emotions do not help with judging an issue impartially, and I actually want people to listen to the evidence for its own sake, not for controversy's sake. I appreciate Dr. Ortlund's ironic tone, but I think there are major problems with the arguments he's making. Not everything is charitable, honestly. He even calls my arguments, which are largely from a scholar, Bigham, out there. And here's a list of words that Ortlund probably would not like his arguments as classified, including out there. So I could call an argument half-baked or careless, ill-informed, ignorant, etc. We can all use cute euphemisms, but if they are intended as a knock against someone else, this does not meet the bar of treating others as we'd like to be treated. And so I think Dr. Ortlund should be held to that, and if I slip under that note, I should be held accountable to that. Now let's get right into the fathers and to the early church writers. Origen. Ortlund reiterates that Origen disagrees with all images and altars. He implies that I argued Origen defended literal statues. In fact, I think he pretty much explicitly says this. Let's quote him. But then in Contra Celsum 820, he speaks of our statues and altars, so people latch onto that and say, he can't be meaning it literally. Therefore, Ortlund's being misleading and taking him, that is Origen, out of context. Craig has said this a couple of times. But all you have to do is just read through the rest of 820. This is clear starting at 817 and then the next two chapters. He, Origen, is repeatedly explicit that when he speaks of statues, temples, and altars, these are not literal statues, temples, and altars, they're metaphors. I find it funny when others say it is I who am misleading with my reading of Origen, because it is the exact opposite of those who want to say Origen does affirm Christian altars and statues. As one could see, he frames the argument as people, whoever they are, arguing Origen supposedly defends Christian statuary. And he says, supposedly, I said this a couple times. And then he corrects this supposedly bad Orthodox reading of Origen by showing that Origen sees Christian statues, temples, and altars as metaphors for Christians. Now, my actual argument, as I stated during our stream and in articles, was that we cannot take blanket condemnations of altars and images as necessarily literal, because we know that the writers making these condemnations accept the existence of Christian altars. This does not prove they accepted Christian images, just like they accepted Christian altars. However, it shows that the inference Ortlund and the Aniconist are making is intrinsically faulty and does not qualify as evidence. That is my actual argument. In any event, Ortlund's presentation of Origen is very faulty. First, Ortlund, due to limited reading, presumes that Origen believed Christian altars were strictly metaphors, implicitly disallowing the idea that Origen acknowledged the existence of literal Christian altars. However, Origen does speak of literal Christian altars. We can read this in his homily on Joshua. It's quoted in Bigham, Early Christian Attitudes Towards Images on page 145. Origen states, "But when you see the nations enter the faith, churches built, altars not covered with the blood of animals, but consecrated by the precious blood of Christ, then say that Jesus has taken the place of Moses and that he possesses the princely powers, not of Jesus, son of none," that's Joshua, "but Jesus, son of God." Now, not only does Origen, St. Cyprian of Carthage, contemporary with him, and St. Ignatius more than 100 years before Origen, likewise speak of Christian altars. This is something I pointed out to Dr. Ortlund more than a year ago. Second, Ortlund's critique is problematic not only because it's wrong, that is problematic, it is also misleading. It certainly seemed to others that I was misciting Origen. How else would he take what I just read a couple of minutes ago from Dr. Ortlund? So one commenter said, exposing that Craig didn't even read the passage of Origen he was quoting from. Incredible! These are some of your best videos, Dr. Ortlund. Yet, what did I actually say? This is quoting myself. Clearly, taking statements here or there at face value is a dead end. What is the actual point? Let's take another look at Book 7 of that's Origen's Against Celsus. Origen reveals that Christians have a Eucharistic sacrifice in contrast to the pagan ones. Right? So it's kind of interesting that paragraph I just read somehow is me supposedly defending Christian statuary. I never said Origen was defending Christian statues. In fact, I've explicitly written the opposite. Now, in response to a Protestant apologist, Lynn Martin, in September, so this is months before this controversy from his video, I wrote the following. For the record, I feel Origen makes rather clear that the statue and even altar in that passage refers to individual Christians. This is why I warned against using the passage as proof of Christian statuary. In any event, my point was to make clear that Origen was condemning pagan images, specifically just as he condemned pagan altars and sacrifices explicitly. And so, to emphasize the passage as iconoclastic is to actually miss the actual thrust of the passage. So it is not proof for images, but it isn't evidence for iconoclasm. And Lynn Martin wrote back, I figured you were saying something of the sort. Because, of course, how would you take my words otherwise? This has always been my argument. Now, surprisingly, Dr. Ortlund was corrected on this before he made his response video to me. In reply to his second community post on the issue, where he cited the same counter-argument against Origen, allegedly defending statuary, I wrote this to him. This actually doesn't address my point in the discussion a year ago, which pertained to the usage of the term altar. Who are the people claiming that Origen defended the existence of literal Christian statuary? I hope you take the time to make a significant reply to the actual content of the arguments you were posed with a year ago. Has Ortlund shown a single person making this argument? Dr. Ortlund's whole reply is by definition a straw man argument. A straw man argument is defined as follows. A form of argument and an informal fallacy of having the impression of refuting an argument, whereas the real subject of the argument was not addressed or refuted, but instead replaced with a false one. So literally, no one of note is arguing that Origen defended literal statuary. Dr. Ortlund even had this pointed out to him. In fact, before me making this video, I contacted him again and I said, listen, I'm going to have to say you're making a straw man argument unless you correct the record on this. And he decided not to correct the record. So why did he attack an argument no one made? Why is much of his audience impressed by attacking an argument no one made? I don't know. But it seriously calls into question his attention to detail and the priority he puts on accurately responding to the other side. It also puts my work unfairly in the worst possible light, a made-up bad argument. I await my actual argument being addressed, and I'm not the only one making it. Father Stephen Bigham, an art history scholar, concurs with me on this point. It is a serious argument, and the fact that it's not being addressed is because it literally invalidates the whole Aniconist basis for rejecting patristic Iconodulia. If they acknowledge the plethora of no image, no altar passages actually have no direct bearing on Christian altars and images, then their consensus of early authorities instantly evaporates. Polemically, they do well to ignore it, but it is interesting that they do. Very interesting. If truth unites values intellectual integrity, they must publicly correct the record on this point. Now, before people freak out, I did not say Truth Unites lacks intellectual integrity. I said it would be in their interest if they value intellectual integrity to make a correction. Only then do I think it is worth addressing why they keep pushing a talking point about altars and images, which I've just shown should be disqualified as a valid inference bearing on the issue of Iconodulia. Now, Eusebius of Caesarea on the image of Christ and the hemorrhaging woman. Let's talk about it. First, Dr. Ortlund claims that the passage says nothing about veneration. Now, this is untrue. As Eusebius mentions, the image is adorned with a cloak, so adorning is a kind of veneration, and healing occurs by virtue of a plant located at the bottom of this cloak. How did people get healed unless they bent down, prostrated, and touched the same part of the cloak that the hemorrhaging woman touched? How is this not evidence of veneration? Second, he claims that Eusebius says the creation of this statuary is a holdover from paganism. While I concur that Eusebius is negative in his evaluation, there's people that disagree, like Father Stephen Bigham. The point is, Ortlund admits that the Gentiles in question here must be converts. So interestingly, Eusebius claims that there were Christians doing this, meaning veneration of art, since apostolic times. Now, Ortlund then quotes Cooper's attempted refutation of this proof text, and interestingly, not my response, which I just gave. Cooper posted this in 2 spots, so maybe Dr. Ortlund missed where I responded, so I'm not sure. So, something to consider. Now let's talk about historical methodology. Dr. Ortlund said this: Craig's general interpretive strategy to jam icon veneration in the 2nd, 3rd century is essentially, it's bad, right? Now, I think it's okay if he takes issue with my historical methodology, though it's consistent and repeatable, unlike his and the Aniconist. I hope it's okay for me to take issue with the general interpretation, the general interpretive strategy of misapplying historical rejections of pagan images as altars, all right, and altars as applying to their Christian equivalents, right? Because that's a interpretive strategy he takes, which has no justification. And literally taking a text from Eusebius that describes veneration, identifies the practices going back to the time of the apostles among Gentile converts, admitting this, and then saying that Christians lacked the practice iconodulia. I mean, that literally contradicts what he just admitted to what was occurring. This historically makes no sense, so I would take issue with that interpretive strategy. I also take issue with the general presentational strategy he used with Origen, you know, the strawman argument. I just felt it was worth pointing that out again. We could take issues with interpretive strategies, presentational strategies. The strategies themselves could be cruel stratagems. Now, the tone may be Ireanic, which is better than nothing, but the interpretive and presentational tacks leave a lot to be desired. A lot. I think Dr. Ortlund, though, does make a good point. If we concede the Ante-Nicene existence of early Christian iconodulia, that it was possibly condemned as aberrant, right? So I don't think it's aberrant, but I think he makes a good point if he concedes the existence of Ante-Nicene iconodulia, that maybe they perceived it as aberrant during Ante-Nicene times. Now, I think this is a step in the right direction, because at least now we all admit that iconodulia preceded the Council of Nicaea. So now at least we're on the same page on that issue. We went from all the evidence, to quote Dr. Ortlund a year ago, showing that there were no Ante-Nicene icons, to, yes, there's evidence, but the Ante-Nicene icons were considered bad. That's a pretty interesting reversal. Now, my response to this, in any event, is that we have to read the sources with attention to detail and in context, and not infer things the sources do not demand we infer. Now, for example, Dr. Ortlund infers that Eusebius rejects the use of Christian imagery. Yet, Eusebius is not opposed to the creation of Christian statuary, because in Life of Constantine, Book 3, chapters 48 to 50, he takes an extremely positive view of it. Let me quote him. Eusebius writes, "Being filled too with divine wisdom, he, Constantine, determined to purge the city of Byzantium, which was to be distinguished by his own name, Constantinople, from idolatry of every kind, that henceforth no statues might be worshipped there in the temples of those falsely reputed to be gods, nor any altars defiled by the pollution of blood, that there might be no sacrifices consumed by fire, no demon festivals, nor any of the other ceremonies usually observed by the superstitious. On the other hand, one might see the fountains in the midst of the marketplace, graced with figures representing the Good Shepherd, well known to those who study the sacred oracles, and that of Daniel, also with the lions, forged in brass and resplendent with plates of gold." So we literally have a statue of Christ and a statue of Daniel and the lions. So this idea that there are no Christian images whatsoever, Eusebius would accept as explicitly contradicted. We see elsewhere in Demonstration of the Christian Faith, Book 5, Chapter 9, where Eusebius speaks positively of a shrine at Mamre, which pictured there are the following: "They who are entertained by Abraham, as represented in the picture, sit one on each side, and he, Jesus, in the midst of them, surpasses them in honor." Right? So we see perhaps the first icon of the Holy Trinity and Mamre existed in Eusebius' day. So therefore, Dr. Ortlund's point is sensible, right? It's not irrational, but it's not supported by the evidence. It has no basis in historical fact. Eusebius likely took issue with the fact the statue which was venerated was likely not originally that of Jesus Christ. It could have been a repurposed pagan statue. This is the most likely explanation, and is the only thing that is actually identified as being specifically aberrant in the passage, other than the brazen cloak, which may imply the cloak itself was objectionable for some reason. Maybe it had its own connection to paganism, I don't know. Yes, it's also possible, but less likely that maybe he did not like that it was venerated specifically, but had no issue with legitimate Christian art. I mean, we can infer that. It's nowhere in the text, though, to infer. It's also possible that when we look at some of Eusebius' supposed rejections of religious art, what is often mentioned is the letter to Constantia. But maybe that's from a different Eusebius, like that of Nicomedia. And maybe that Eusebius denies all Christian imagery, while this Eusebius mentioned it at least 3 times. Right? So the fact that Eusebius says art doesn't exist and this Eusebius says it does, it could be a different Eusebius. We simply do not have enough detail reading Eusebius of Caesarea in isolation, because taken at face value, he contradicts himself. Now, methodologically, the best historical approach would be to look at other 4th century witnesses to the practice, such as St. Gregory and Nyssa, to contextualize things. Because again, Eusebius doesn't offer us that context. It's a contradiction in him not explaining how the art was used. Now, St. Gregory Nyssa positively defends Iconodulia in the same century. Additionally, when St. Epiphanius does what I'll cutely call a straw poll in the church of the practice, almost everyone, he says, defends it. Almost everyone. So I fail to see how we could take a practice that is acknowledged to be Ante-Nicene and has its defenders among the ecclesiastics and arbitrarily choose Epiphanius' evaluation over that of the saints, other saints and contemporaries. This is arbitrary and only works if we are reading the evidence already concluding aniconism from the onset. All right? And that is not a good interpretive strategy for history. Let's talk about Ireaneus and the Acts of John. Now, Dr. Ortlund treats these texts similarly to Eusebius, claiming they were rejecting heathen practice. Yet, Ireaneus doesn't actually call the adorning of images heathen. Ireaneus calls the other modes of honoring whatever they were to these images Gentile. Now, Dr. Ortlund believes that because the observation came in a critique of Gnostics, and the Gnostics are bad, that essentially everything they were doing must be considered bad by default. And honestly, I'm sympathetic to this. But this logic does not work, nor does Irenaeus' words demand this reading. For example, let's take the Acts of John. As Dr. Ortlund points out, it was written by the Gnostics. So if we apply this interpretive methodology, because the Acts of John has a negative view of icons, right? And so if they're bad people and they have this negative view of icons, if we approach that interpretive methodology consistently, then if the writer of the Acts of John is a bad Gnostic, wouldn't that make the practice of venerating Christian art there by default good? Right? That's if we applied the same logic. But wait, he doesn't do that now, does he? There's something inherently wrong with one's analysis where the interpretive methodology that the Iconists employ is not repeatable and actually leads to contradictory results, right? Your methodology does not work. There's also an ecclesiastical assumption that I notice shifts quite a bit for Dr. Ortlund over whose opinion counts and whose does not. So does the Christian pilgrim in Nazareth count? No, that person is too unimportant. Does Constantine or his wife's opinion count? No, they're too secular. Does St. Gregory Nyssa and the majority of ecclesiastics in St. Epiphanius' day count? No, because they disagree with him. Does Epiphanius count? Of course, because he agrees with me. Does Origen and a bunch of vague condemnations of pagan practice count, even though they don't explicitly weigh in on Christian art? Of course, because I want them to, right? This is not compelling historical methodology. That's what I take issue with. My methodology is very straightforward. What do the ancient sources actually say about, one, how the art was used? I mean, that is the crucial point at issue after all. And two, whether it was accepted in the church. Well, number one, they all say it was venerated. That's what every source says. Up until St. Gregory the Great, for 600 years. That's what every source says. So that's pretty important. I can't exactly ignore that in my historical analysis. Two, when we get proportions concerning how many people within the mainline church venerated the art, because we have those proportions provided to us by St. Gregory, by St. Epiphanius. The vast majority were iconodule. right? That's what St. Epiphanius tells us. So this is not a suspect interpretive strategy. This is the only methodology that actually makes sense. My challenge is to Dr. Ortlund to lay out a consistent, non-contradictory historical methodology to counter this. It's telling if we don't see that, because my opinion is that the Iconist arguments pushed by scholarship and apologists are ad hoc and are not the result of sound methodology. Now let's talk about Tertullian, right? He's a fun guy. Now Dr. Ortlund observes a pivot between demonstrating the existence of iconography and then automatically considering that the art was venerated. Now, I actually think that's a good critique. But Ortlund himself pushes the narrative that Christian art did not exist within the church. So the positive demonstration of the art's existence is actually necessary if people claim it didn't exist. So the pivoting is actually done by the Aniconist. It didn't exist, and if it existed, it's bad, right? That's the pivot. Now, second, barring an explanation where it is stated that the art was only understood to be decorative, isn't it presumptuous to automatically presume that that was its purpose, right? This is suspect considering that every single reference to how Christian art was used pertains to its veneration. So the historian has a not-so-tough decision. Presume for no textual reason that the art was simply decorative, or to take serious all the contemporary evidence which explains its usage as consistent with veneration. So methodology is key. Methodology. And obviously, you'd pick the second of those two choices. Now, as for Tertullian, I think it's a valid interpretation that Tertullian is critiquing Christians who made pagan idols, and not Christian images on idolatry. However, my interpretation is more nuanced due to on modesty containing Christian imagery and a contemporary synopolitist commenting that Christian artists are to be taught how to make new things. So we know that Christian art existed, and though I acknowledge the obvious reading Tertullian as condemning pagan idol makers, Christians are making pagan idols, I infer that the passage may be a veiled critique of Christian art as well. Now, I did not fail to give the standard interpretation, right, the one that Dr. Ortlund gave in detail in my response to John Carpenter on this exact passage years ago. Now, quoting myself, because Dr. Ortlund made it seem like I did not acknowledge that this is a valid interpretation. Well, what does Craig actually say, and not what Dr. Ortlund says Craig says? Craig says this: it should be noted that when we read the source on the surface, the point at issue is not images in the church per se. We even find that there seems to be some allowance for crosses. The quoting Tertullian on Idolatry, chapter 5. The serpent of bronze, after the manner of one uphung, denote the shape of the Lord's cross, which has set us free from serpents. The debate is seemingly over whether someone can make pagan images for someone else as his vocation. Whether we can infer anything more, such as Tertullian exaggerating his ban on all images as the cross does not fall under it, is at first hard to tell. So that's what I actually wrote. Now, he apparently read my article because he quotes my citation on idolatry, because this didn't come up in our 5-minute short exchange on the issue. But he frames my discussion on the topic literally contrary to my explicit words. Now, unlike Origen, I don't think this is intentionally a straw man argument, because my argument here actually requires some in-depth interpretation of the evidence compared to simply making up bias defending statuary from Origen, but it does show that his rebuttal misses the mark. Now let's talk about the Grotto of Nazareth. Now, Bugatti and Bigham view the icondulic rendering of the surviving Greek in an inscription as the most likely rendering. Now, I am not at fault for giving what is the most likely rendering. No good variant rendering that makes any sense has been posed for the Grotto of Nazareth. For those not aware, it essentially says that under the image M, I adorned the image. Now, Dr. Ortlund points out that Rico gives a variant rendering which literally renders the word image to be completely meaningless. Hence, this rendering makes no sense, and it's divorced from context because the archaeological site was covered with images, including St. John the Baptist. Now, look at one of the variants that Dr. Ortlund points out from Bugatti, right? So he doesn't want to take the variant that disagrees with him, right? So he's going to pull at any variant that may help him build the aniconist case. Now, another variant from Bugatti is, I arranged well what suits her. Now, just think about this for a second. Arranged what? Do you arrange things for your images at home? Arranged may be a reference to any number of things. It could be some sort of adorning of the image. It could theoretically be some sort of offering of incense, the placement of a sacrifice, God forbid. Who knows? With history, we go with the most likely. Hence, the appeals with gratuitous adverbs I've noticed, like such as the inscription is very damaged, it is very ambiguous, we are not 100% sure what it says, etc., is obviously dismissive and defensive. It is typical of the arguments of skeptics. Of course the proceeding is true, but it's framed incorrectly. The inscription is damaged, but it's decipherable. It is ambiguous in as much as it's missing some letters. We are not 100% sure what it says, but we could gather what it probably said. This is the nature of archaeology. Now, Bingham and Bagatti both presume a dating before for this inscription before the building of Constantine's church on the site in approximately the year 325 AD. So a 2nd and 3rd century dating is very compelling by archaeological standards. Dr. Ortlund was expressing doubt in how early we could date these things, but anyone who has been to old churches such as in Rome knows that they've been built on top of previous churches, shrines, or grave sites. All right, so the fact this inscription was found below a church built in 325 means it had to be older than 325. It's not a very complicated theory in archaeology. Now, I've been to Rome, and I've seen it myself. I visited a pre-Nicene church in Rome by mistake, by breaking the rules. I was walking in a medieval church, and around the year, I think, 700-800, this church was dated. And I walked down to the basement because it was not locked. You know, why else would you not do that, right? And I found a pre-Nicene church in Rome. So I know exactly what it's like. And that's why it's underground, because they build the new churches on top of old shrines and churches. So I don't know why it always works out this way, but literally, like if you go see archaeological sites, the oldest parts are underground. And on top is the newer stuff, like a newer 1,500-year-old church. Somehow, like, this dirt keeps accumulating. You're like, well, the earth doesn't get more dirt, so where's this all come from? I have no clue. But that's how it works in archaeology. So, as I referred to previously, the inscription of the grotto is found under the church, which means it's by default older. So we can, with pretty good confidence, date this thing into the 2nd and 3rd centuries. This is not like cope dating. This is just kind of standard archaeology. Now, additionally, from what I could tell, none of the existing art at the same site has halos and Byzantine elements that connote a dating before the 4th century, right? And so, beginning the 4th century, these began adding halos to Christ, and then in the 5th century to the saints. So this helps us date when the art is from, because if things from the same site are from a dating pre-Nicene and it's found under a church that was made pre-Nicaea, kind of makes sense to date it as pre-Nicene. It's very solid historically. Now, I think if there were halos in this art and stuff, there would be hearing about this because it would settle the issue that the whole site is much newer than Bingham and Bagatti are claiming. Now, maybe Dr. Ortlund has never studied archaeology or has never been to an archaeological site, and I'm sure his audience mostly has not been either. But I find the degree of skepticism based upon the evidence we actually have, concerning the significance of the evidence, as I've just shown, to be wholly unjustified. We, when we do history, go with probabilities. My case is the most probable, backed by archaeological methodology, art history, and context at the site. Their skepticism is just based upon intransigence, right? So my methodology is consistent and compelling, and they're just being intransigent. So I think what is most likely is more compelling than the special pleading of an iconist. Now let's talk about St. Epiphanius. Now, I addressed the significance of the passage of Epiphanius explaining how icons are used, and he making clear that only a few people agree that there's a rejection of icons. So let me focus on this. Dr. Ortlund quotes St. Epiphanius in saying that, who are among the Holy Fathers ever prostrated himself in front of an image, right? So Dr. Ortlund's claiming this shows that this was something brand new starting the 4th century, but the problem is this is obviously an exaggeration. As he even said where people, because Epiphanius himself said people were doing it during his own day. St. Gregory of Nyssa in the same century wrote about doing it. Eusebius makes a similar exaggeration, for example, in his letter of Constantia earlier in the century. So, right, Eusebius wrote, might be different Eusebius from Eusebius Caesarea, but the point is, he says, the law states that no likeness should be made either of what is in heaven or what is in the earth beneath. Have you ever heard of anything of the kind, either yourself in church or from another person? So, presuming the authenticity of the letter of Constantia, we know that Eusebius here says You've never heard of such a thing, but yet he acknowledges the existence of images in the saints 3 different times in 3 other works. So clearly the evidence we have already reviewed show that the practice of venerating images preceded Epiphanius. Now, Truth Unite's treatment of Epiphanius reminds me a lot of papal apologetics, because they'll read exaggerated language, the papist about the Pope, they'll take it literally, and they don't interpret it in light of facts and other statements from the writer in question and contemporaries. They just go with the exaggerated language and take it literally. But that's not how we do good history, all right? Now let's talk a little bit about St. Gregory the Great. Now, Aniconists hang their hat on Gregory the Great, only citing a didactic use for art. If this rationale was written much earlier and frequently, instead of just once for the first time in the year 600, this would be a good talking point, all right? But it wasn't, so it's a bad talking point. Taking Gregory the Great's teaching in the year 600 and oppose it on top of how all the earlier evidence suggests how the art was used is not good history. St. Gregory was writing to an iconoclast in his day, in a context where the Pope of Rome was understood to be simply a prominent but local bishop with no real power over others. So of course he was going to give a moderate defense against an iconoclast. The iconoclast Ireaneus of Masella lived somewhere where apparently the images were adored, which in Latin literally means worship, and so it would be justifiable that I have images if people were literally worshiping them. But there are other mitigating factors we must consider when dealing with the proof text St. Gregory the Great. To this day, Western veneration practices are considerably more muted than those in the East. Like Protestants, so they're aware, you're not going to go to a Roman Catholic church and they're going to kiss the feet of statues. Like Orthodox will kiss the feet of saints on an icon. It's just not something you'll see. The style of veneration in the West could have been the real pointed issue that people were fighting over. Not the literal offering of sacrifices to images. So Gregory, who defended praying to the saints, likely would have had no issue of people simply looking at the image and praying, because he elsewhere all over the place talks about it's okay to pray to saints and endorses the practice. So whether this is what's going on or not, we really don't know because he never mentions it, but it's bizarre to say that someone who prays to the saints, thinking images are didactic about the saints, would arbitrarily disallow for praying in the presence of the image, right? So the real issue isn't praying in the presence of the image, it would be how you treat the image, perhaps, and how he says the image was treated was adoration, literal worship, which Orthodox don't affirm. Now, just so people are aware, St. Gregory the Great was a deacon before he was pope. He was one of the papal legates in Constantinople, so he would have not been unaware of Eastern custom. So we cannot take a passage from Gregory where he gives a rationale for art as a rejection of other rationales, provided that they do not contradict, right? So there's no contradiction of art being didactic and art also being venerated, right? And so automatically presuming they contradict is just arbitrary, quite frankly. Now, this is an argument from silence, right? Just because he doesn't contradict, it doesn't mean he approved the veneration of art. So we can't say he endorsed Iconodulia, because it's just not what the passage says. But it means he did not explicitly reject it, and we cannot cite that as evidence that Iconodulia was lacking, because that's just an argument from silence. It is telling that the Aniconists have to deal hyper-skeptically with centuries of evidence preceding Gregory in the year 600, and then cling to Gregory as being our best explanation for our practice, which originated from their mission in apostolic times, despite him writing nearly 600 years after the fact. This is just not good historical methodology. It only makes sense if you already know you want to conclude an Aniconist reading of the evidence. Now, the doctrinal development trap. He sets a trap, Dr. Ortlund, and as Admiral Akbar says, it's a trap. We should avoid the trap. Of course, Dr. Ortlund wants to have, to quote him, an open-minded discussion about doctrinal development and claim this is where they make their most compelling case. Why would he want that conversation? For one, doctrinal development simply justifies doctrinal innovations. Protestantism is an ahistorical faith with no genuine antecedents until Luther. They need doctrinal development. So why would he want to have that conversation, doctrinal development, right? Because they need it. Second, Father Dimitri Stăniloae, a modern-day saint in who lived in Romania, he's now dead, taught that we clarify verbiage, but we don't actually teach new things. So the Orthodox don't accept Numenian doctrinal development, right? So he wants to have the conversation other than where the Orthodox have it, because if you notice, the points I bring up are much more compelling than all the doctrinal development arguments that people are making, saying, oh, well, my view of doctrinal development is more fitting and prudent than your view of doctrinal development, right? Like if Iconodulia actually historically existed, you wouldn't need to make those sort of silly arguments. Now, third, I believe that Truth Unites is attempting to shift attention away from the fact that aniconism is built upon a flimsy historical basis, right? He wants people to be arguing his doctrinal development because it's a weak case, and that makes Protestantism look stronger. And he wants to shift attention away from the fact that the Aniconist case is weak. Now think about this. Aniconists misrepresent the significance of critiques of pagan practices and apply this to Christian ones when the passages do not bear this out. They shoehorn the Aniconist negative glosses of Ireaneus and such, which are just not there in the text because it suits their purposes. That's not very compelling. They, the Aniconists, inconsistently deal with evidence such as their treatment of the Acts of John, right? So they'll interpret Ireaeus one way and say it's a condemnation because it's Gnostics, but they won't read the Acts of John and take that as a positive proof of icon veneration because it's a Gnostic source. That's inconsistent. The Aniconists deal hyper-skeptically with the archaeological evidence because it's inconvenient to them. They ignore the explicit historical fact that every single historical reference to how art was used until St. Gregory the Great, almost 600 years after the time of Christ, explains the utility of Christian art is that it was venerated. This includes both negative and positive mentions of the practice. Both negative and positive. So that's taking the whole spectrum of evidence, and they ignore it. Not very compelling. I could see why you wouldn't want to argue over the actual historical case because the historical case is so weak. They offer no interaction with the consensus view amongst Ante-Nicene Jews and Christians that art was obviously perceived as apotropaic or magical, right? So the Jews and the Christians, it's not debated whether it's a cross, whether it's a picture image, whether it's an object you put on your door with a scripture in it, like a mezuzah. They all viewed these things as apotropaic. And this has no corresponding reality with the Aniconists because they're secular and Protestant. So this is a glaring omission, right? So like the claim that, oh, you know, the art was just decorative when no one believed art was just decorative. There was a consensus it was apotropaic. There's zero doubt over this. To me, shows how weak the Aniconist case is. Now, if people simply looked at the evidence impartially and with discerning eyes, they would not consider Aniconism for a second. The Aniconist case is just too methodologically inconsistent, skeptical, and self-serving. It's eisegetical. The only way one looks at the evidence and concludes that the early church was Aniconist is that if that's the conclusion, you already wanted to draw. And that's a pretty bad way of proving a thesis. So, if Dr. Ortlund wants to put his reading of the evidence to the test against myself, I recommend that we have a mutual discussion where we civilly speak these things out instead of making strawmen and doing these back and forth response videos, because I don't find these very useful. It's not a good format for our respective audiences because they don't listen to what the other person has to say. And if we, the apologists, cannot model a civil conversation with give and take, where people hear that we're understanding what the other side is saying, then our audiences are not going to understand what the other side is saying. If we model correct discussion, then our audiences will be more able to deal with the evidence in a dispassionate way. Now, it's possible people don't want to deal with the evidence in a dispassionate way. Certainly our audiences, right? That's why I've taken a lot of measures to avoid feeding into this. And so I want to orient this discussion so we can actually talk about the evidence. That's what's important. So guys, that is my response. And so I want to keep this conversation going. So down below is the Discord link. Let's keep that conversation going. And if this has blessed you, finally someone's really dealt with this evidence in a conclusive manner that has helped you, please bless the churches in Cambodia. orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. It's in the link below. Donate $1, $5, how many ever dollars to help support evangelism in Cambodia. Bring the people in the most Buddhist country on earth to the Orthodox Christian faith. That would be a real blessing if you could support that ministry. Please pray for the ministry. Please pray for me. And I will end this as I end all my videos by saying, fight to the death for the truth. And the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.